Jump into the context. So again, that's going to be the definitions for our research, how we got started, and a discussion on our literature review. So for those of you unaware, DIY is all it stands for is do it yourself, which is pretty straightforward, just you do the thing. But for punk, I think you could poll 100 people and get 100 different definitions, and maybe no one would be satisfied with any of them. But given that, we wanted to pull out some sort of tenets of DIY punk that really helped shape this presentation and will shape the discussion today. So maintaining and growing the scene is the responsibility of every member. And that doesn't mean necessarily that everyone contributes the same way or the same amount, but it means that, you know, you're supporting bands, you're supporting the venues, you're promoting for shows, you're creating art, you're creating music. It just means that you're participating actively in the community. DIY requires us to do our own work because we are the ones that understand our needs. I think there are countless examples of corporate entities, be it promoters, venues, record labels, who have just taken bands and music scenes and wrung them dry for every penny that they can, and then left them to pursue the next thing. And it's really important that when we can solve our own issues, that we take steps to do so. And while subgenres of punk might look different, there's hundreds. I could sit here and name them all day, and they might all look different and express themselves in different ways. They do all, sort of root themselves in self-expression through music, clothing, and art. So in Imon Tuel's article, Putting Critical Information Literacy into Context, How and Why Librarians Adopt Critical Practices in Their Teaching, they provide this quote that we felt was really great at bridging the gap between DIY and critical information literacy. At its core, critical information literacy is an attempt to render visible the complex workings of information so that we may identify and act upon the power structures that shape our lives. And rather than giving like a massive definition for critical information literacy at a critical information literacy conference, we felt it was important to pull out components of critical information literacy that helped guide our discussion and guide our research when we were putting this all together. So it's important that you set up your classroom to share power. And what I mean by that is not that you give up all power or cede power equally to everyone, because you are ultimately responsible for how the class goes and teaching the content. But it does mean that, between the beginning and the end, you allow students to sort of shape the way that that class goes. And it's very important that you critically analyze the things that you're teaching. So sources that you bring into the class, are you only bringing in canon sources? And if so, why are you only bringing in canon sources? Are you discussing what sources might be left out, the voices that are left out of those sources? And, even if you are just using canon sources, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but you should be talking to your students about those. Right? You should be saying like, hey, these are the things that are foundational, but these are the people that are left out of those. And that critical analysis can and should happen before you enter the classroom and with your students. Students, should be a part of that, and you can model that critical analysis for them. And using information literacy, critical information literacy, you can start to combat tenets of white supremacy. So things like neutrality, things like perfectionism, these are things that we can start to tackle in the classroom. So talking about, the research process being a messy thing, and, that everyone struggles with these things and that you're not alone in those struggles, to acknowledging, I used to be an engineering librarian, and all the time students would tell me, well, there's no bias in this research because a robot did it, or like a robot, generated this data. And we would have a discussion about why robots are not neutral. why AI is not a neutral thing. It was coded by a human. It was given its instructions by a human, and so of course those human biases are going to creep in. And I think one of the best examples I can give of that is facial recognition technology. If darker skin it's harder to differentiate. Many of the AI programs have a difficulty differentiating between darker skin, and that can lead to like really serious consequences for people of color. So it's important that you start talking about these things explicitly in the classroom, and we will talk a little bit more about that later in our presentation.
Thanks, Edward. I also wanted to provide a little bit of context for how we started having this conversation. Edward and I actually started a little reading group, just the two of us, during the lockdown, during the early stages of the pandemic. And we read a couple of books. We read Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and we read Teaching to Transgress, Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, Teaching to Transgress by Bell Hooks. Both of them really influenced the way that we started to think about being critical in the classroom, sharing power in the classroom, and talking about issues that are going to impact students' lives so that they can start to really claim agency in what is like a very capitalist society. While reading this, though, we really latched on to this idea of community building in the one-shot session and trying to understand, because most of our instruction is in a one-shot setting, we were trying to understand what it would look like and what it would mean for us to apply these ideas about community building, especially the way that Bell Hooks wrote about them, to a library setting.
So the whole book, Teaching to Transgress, is just fantastic. But I latch onto, and we latched onto, a lot of the things from chapter 10, which is her discussion with Ron Scapp. And this quote, sorry, it's a block of text. It comes from that. And this is sort of what really got the wheels turning for this presentation. When I enter the classroom at the beginning of the semester, the weight is on me to establish that our purpose is to be, for however brief a time, a community of learners together. It positions me as a learner, but I'm also not suggesting that I don't have more power. And I'm not trying to say we're all equal here. I'm trying to say that we are all equal here to the extent that we are equally committed to creating a learning context.
There were a few other themes that jumped out at us that have kind of come up again and again as we think about the parallels between critical information literacy and DIY punk communities. And what a few of those are the importance of the personal experience as important to giving students voices, but also like sharing personal experiences and other parts of your life that you're in community with. The second one is being really serious in learning spaces or in community spaces and really listening to others. This doesn't necessarily mean, not like having fun or not smiling in those spaces, but just taking seriously what you're doing and what you're talking about. And then there's this idea of collective responsibility. We kind of talked about this with the definition of DIY punk, but we're also thinking about the importance of sharing the responsibility for the classroom environment with everybody that is a part of that space. And we've been really interested, again, in just thinking about how we actually apply this to the library classroom. So we wanted to go ahead and provide a little bit of a literature review because other folks have thought about some of these topics before us. I would like to preface by saying that I see punk ethos everywhere, especially in critical librarianship. And whether it's intentional or not, some of these like rebellious attitudes of scholars, zinesters, librarians, anybody that's working in that critical librarian space really have a lot of strategies that I could draw parallels to punk. But specifically, especially for this literature review and this presentation today, we're thinking more along the lines of like how punk relates to pedagogy, library instruction, and critical information literacy. So let's start by looking at pieces that have kind of developed a punk rock pedagogy. Possibly the first piece was written by Seth Kahn Egan, and it was an article titled Pedagogy of the Pissed. It came out in the late 90s. And Con Egan focuses on the composition classroom. He is a writing instructor. And he defines punk and punk pedagogy with a real emphasis on punk as an action-driven resistance that actually seeks to provide alternative ways of existing. He used assignments that were really focused on questioning authority, which when I was reading through it, it was really interesting. I think there's some immediate ties to the frameworks and to critical information literacy. And a different piece in a book titled Punk Rockers Revolution, A Pedagogy of Race, Class, and Gender, two authors, Mallet and Pena, provide a qualitative study of ideologies represented in punk lyrics across 6 major labels through the 80s and 90s. This research is helpful for illustrating that sometimes punk can be really progressive, but sometimes it can have really kind of backwards or conservative ideologies. And this has happened throughout the history of punk. The authors also provide a really insightful analysis of punk ideologies and class analysis. Specifically, they apply Gramsci's idea of counter-hegemonic education, and I find it to be really helpful. They talk about both punk and education spaces as spaces that can uphold racist, sexist, capitalist values of the status quo, but sharing power in either space with marginalized people and voices and being really explicitly anti-racist, anti-sexist, and anti-capitalist can produce counter-hegemonic education. And in her book, DIY Punk as Education, Rebecca Cordova explores the relationship between punk and education with a real focus on educational theory. And this was pretty interesting to me, although I didn't fully grasp all of it. But Cordova develops a framework for punk pedagogy that focuses really on self-directed learning to combat miseducation and realize what she calls educative healing. So with all of that in mind, I think it's interesting to start to look at how some of this is applied. I think of that as kind of like a framework, but I'm interested in how folks are talking about actually applying punk in a classroom. Not yet in a library classroom, but in a classroom in general. And I see this as kind of like two-fold. So with strategies and then the content that's actually being taught. So in his thesis, Bad Rhetoric, Michael Utley applies hardcore punk to education to try to find strategies for constructing a punk classroom. So the main strategies that he identifies are adopting a DIY ethos in the classroom. So actually creating your own lesson plans, not using somebody else's lesson plans, and really taking efforts to resist dominant narratives in the classroom. He also seeks to encourage people to transform the student-teacher relationship into a much more meaningful relationship while dismantling oppressive structures and oppressive assignments, both in the classroom and more broadly in education. I think the most helpful author for understanding the content piece of what's actually being taught in the classroom is Noah Romero, who offers helpful insight in a couple of different articles where he writes about the important ways that punk has inspired his approach to critical pedagogy. Romero develops a concept of punk rock pedagogy that uses a framework that really focuses on the contextual and conceptual and looks to a historical analysis of punk rock to seek out how to use artistic communication with really explicit anti-imperialist, anti-oppression, and anti-racist messaging. He seeks to build solidarity in the classroom and looks specifically to the history of BIPOC punk solidarity building to inform the way that he talks about a lot of this stuff. And he takes this in application to thinking about free speech within education and specifically combating hate speech in the classroom. So with these two together, you're sharing power, you're transforming the relationship in the classroom, but you're also having a content piece where you're actually being really explicit about the messaging that you're having with your students. Of course, all of this is more focused on just education in general. So I found a couple of pieces that actually have been written that talk about punk and how they function within a library classroom. These were both published in volumes 1 and 2 of the Critical Library Pedagogy book, and they were, let's start with the first one. Amy Gilligan's piece, Teaching with Riot Girl, is a piece that introduces and shares lesson plans for first-year college students that explores the history of Riot Girl feminism and punk using library resources. The second piece is by Caitlin Shanley and Laura Chance, titled Search and Destroy Punk Rock Tactics for the Library, for Library Instruction. They draw on Girls Rock Camp to inspire their pedagogy that they refer to as a Girls Rock pedagogy, which is like a really fast-paced instruction that is really focused on empowering learners within the classroom. In these teachers, the authors emphasize the importance of incorporating social justice topics into the class, collaborating with students to shape the space, and seeking whose voices might be left out, and even integrating non-traditional sources into the classroom, such as zines. This presentation really kind of builds on the work that they brought to the field. So I found this literature review to be really eye-opening, just because, of course, other people have thought about this before, but what was really interesting was how much folks were drawing on their own experiences to inform their teaching practices. So in this section, Edward and I will be sharing our experiences with DIY punk and what we're drawing on for this presentation.
Yeah, so when I first started thinking about my experience with getting into hardcore punk and sharing it with you all, I was pretty nervous to do that because honestly, I didn't come up through a scene that was initially very hospitable. And I thought that by sharing that experience, I might be just kind of cutting these ideas down at the knee that we're trying to share. But the more I thought about it and the more that we learned and put this presentation together, the more I realized like, oh, this actually really reinforces the things that we're saying here. So when I first started in Denver hardcore, it was very much a boys club. It was very jockey. It was very like masculine. And I don't know how much y'all know about hardcore punk, but the moshing is can be very violent, and it's not meant to be towards someone, but there are those that like it to be towards someone, and it was a pretty violent space to be in, and the health and safety of other people really weren't considered, and because of that, the scene really started to fade away and was almost non-existent for a while. The music started to move to other cities. And that was until a really strong youth culture came up, and they were actively shaping what they wanted the scene to be. They were no longer booking bands that were associated with the guys that were formerly trying to run the scene. They would eject people, like ban them. It wasn't like a thing that happened through police. It wasn't through any sort of outside enforcement. It was through their own enforcement. It was to make other people feel safe, and it worked. The current scene is really thriving. There's tons of bands from Denver that are really doing well. There's a record label called Convulse Records that is really starting to get a bigger following nationally. So everything is really starting to rise up, and that is because of an intentionally created inclusive culture in Denver. And it's not a perfect culture, of course, but they actively take steps to listen to the community and to continue to shape it. I'm going to also be sharing some photos just to sort of, give some more context to you all. And these photos were taken by a friend of mine, Joe Lacey, from the Convulse Records Fest. So this is a band called Asbestos. In the photo, you can see my friend Sam singing and my friend Q on bass, and then some people in the background just kind of enjoying themselves. And the reason why we're sharing these photos, I'm just very proud of this, to be honest. I'm really proud of the scene that Denver has become, and how active and just happy everyone seems to be, and how much they care for one another. So just wanted to share some of that with you all.
Thanks, Edward. Yeah, and I think these photos are really, really helpful context to kind of sharing some imagery of what these spaces can look like. So my introduction to DIY punk shows happened in Lafayette, Indiana. I was like in my early 20s, and I started to going to shows at an old warehouse. It was a space that had been converted from these from just an old warehouse into a studio space for musicians and artists. And the owner started to let local musicians begin organizing shows there. Well, not all of these shows were technically punk. They really had like this punk ethos. The common theme throughout them was that regardless of the genre, the community of musicians and showgoers were building something together for one another and not for anyone else. It was really important that everyone that was participating found their own way and did it kind of outside of the establishments that already existed in the town. These shows were totally different from any like house shows that I had gone to earlier in my life, such as like college parties and that kind of thing. These shows were really specifically about the music, no longer about partying, much more about building community around that music. While there weren't like any written rules about how to conduct yourself in this space, everyone really conducted themselves with a lot of respect. I mean, as Edward mentioned, there could be a lot of moshing, it could get relatively violent, but it was kind of it within a set of norms for a space. I didn't really fully understand like how these rules worked until I saw them play out a little bit. There was someone who was generally disrespecting a space and being like overly violent during a set that was not meant for that kind of thing. And there were punks in the scene that came together and like actually moved him from the space and talked to him. He was able to come back into the show and enjoy the rest of the show, kind of understanding the norms. But you know, he wasn't thrown out by bouncers. We didn't call the police. The owner didn't get involved. It was done by the community to create a safe space for everybody that was there. I didn't really start to experience kind of the DIY hardcore punk that Edward was mentioning until I moved to Champaign-Urbana. I moved there and I would eventually go to graduate school there, but upon moving there, I immediately started to seek out shows. And I found the music community to be really welcoming. It was somewhat sporadic, but there were plenty of punks playing basement shows there. The show organizers were really adamant about drawing in the community. They looked to not just band members, but also regular attendees of the shows to help in constructing the scene. Everyone was really encouraged to do things like flyer the town for shows, actively promote and invite folks and friends, both online on social media and like offline, wherever you meet folks in a coffee shop or whatever. And this really led to a very engaged community around the shows. The shows also happened in these tiny little intimate basements where there just wasn't a lot of space between you and the band. You'd practically be on top of one another. So once people started moving around, everyone was playing a very active role in actually creating the show experience, whether you're singing in the band or if you're just, you know, a member of the audience. Show organizers were also super explicit in their promotion of the shows, especially when it came to community standards. So flyers or Facebook events would often read "no cops, no phobes," and they would explicitly express that if you weren't going to show up and be respectful, then you were not welcome in those spaces. So while I was always kind of participating in DIY punk spaces as an audience member, these shows in Champaign really broke down that distinction between the organizers of the space, the band members, the audience members, and encouraged everybody to like pick up whatever piece they could to participate. And that's actually where I met Edward.
Yeah, Champaign had a similar experience for me. I think I became like more involved just doing things. I think when you're in a smaller scene, it's easier to start picking things up, like Kevin said, and started photographing shows and joined a very short-lived band that played one show. And that's how I met Kevin. We didn't even know that we were in the same program, and that sort of began this relationship, and is how we started talking about this project, where we just kept in touch and kept discussing these ideas. So now we want to talk about start to draw the comparisons between DIY punk and critical information literacy. We've already started a little bit, and I'm sure that you can see how these things start to play out. But we want to make those connections clear. So both DIY and critical information literacy demand community participation. Creating space for everyone's voice is very important. And not only that, you should be platforming marginalized voices where and when possible. And actively engaged participation is really important, right? So like if I'm trying to offer students a way to participate, but they aren't participating, that doesn't mean that like they're doing bad, you know, but the experience of the class is going to be different than if you can create a space where all the students feel welcomed, feel engaged, and can participate. Your class will just change, obviously. And lack of effort can cause the community to atrophy. So like I talked about in, you know, sort of my experiences with Denver Hardcore, if people don't want to be there, that's going to be very obvious, right? And that doesn't mean that everyone has to be working all the time to set up this this community, but that does mean that, you know, people do need to want to engage with you. You do need to set up a classroom that is easy for students to engage. That way, this effort can kind of come naturally, can come easily, or more easily, I should say, because, you know, students get nervous too. But without that community effort, it can start to atrophy. And again, this culture is created through intentional behavior. It's not enough to say that your classroom is anti-racist or anti-imperialist or anti-phobe. Like you have to be explicit with that. You have to challenge ideas. You need to be vocal. You know, it's no use just dancing around it. Like you should be explicit. And that doesn't mean necessarily that, you know, you don't, you should be challenging ideas first. You know, sometimes students can get, you know, beyond what is, you know, the situation can be too confrontational. And so maybe you want to check out of that or trying to step away, but challenge ideas, don't let things go left unsaid, and really make sure that you are creating an intentional culture in your classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that intention is so important. One of the parallels that we were thinking about is this relationship between the very limited time and space that we have with students and that happen in punk shows. And for that reason, we have to be really intentional in both spaces, right? So with punk shows, they are often really quick. The bands will set up as quickly as they can, play maybe a 20 or 30-minute set. They're usually really quick songs, and then tear down, and the next band will set up. And it just happens really quickly, sometimes over in like an hour and a half, which is much shorter than like, you know, kind of your bigger, more mainstream show could be. And so I think about then the library classroom and just how, you know, oftentimes we only have 50 minutes within a one shot. If we're lucky, we'll get them back later in the semester, or we can follow up with research consultations, but we really just have to be intentional, like in that amount of time that we have together. Another parallel that we drew out is that is how to kind of engage outside of the space where you meet students or you meet up with your community. So while DIY Punk can really engage with folks outside of shows in a more like set way, because you can establish friendships and you have a whole lot of like, it's the real world, and there are like relationships that you can build, and there's a little bit more flexibility there with practicing information literacy and building relationships with students, kind of seeking out those research consultations or like continued conversations about these issues is a way that this can kind of start to parallel. And that kind of leads into this idea of like walking away with an attitude from either space that can be applied to daily life. Oftentimes with punk, you think about like being anti-establishment or questioning authority, which is actually one of the same messages that I really encourage students, at least questioning authority, to try to walk away from the critical information literacy classroom, because they can start to apply that to their daily life, right? I think in both spaces, you can walk away with these ideas of questioning authority, really having a critical perspective and outlook on life, and just like asking questions, and starting to think about whose voices are left out of large conversations, and figuring out how you can draw them into the conversation and get those voices involved. So with those parallels in mind, we wanted to go ahead and start to illustrate some of the strategies that we think that we pull from DIY Punk to apply to the critical information literacy classroom. The first strategy that comes to mind is building community. So in the library, we can build community in a lot of different spaces. This, of course, can be with students, but in order to start to build those relationships and break down those power dynamics in the classroom to establish a community with students, we have to start by like kind of framing the entrance into that entire space. And that takes building community with both librarians and faculty, and being really clear about what your values are and how you intend to operate within the classroom. This can be really helpful or made a lot easier if you're able to find other people who practice critical pedagogy within your institution, or even outside of your institution, to kind of build like communities of practice. But opening up a dialogue with other folks about how to start to shift the culture around instruction in general, both inside the library and outside of the library, can be really helpful. And more broadly within the library, it's really important to build community with workers kind of across the library, even if they're not directly involved in the instruction process, just because you want to create an environment, if you can, that is focused on these ideals all around, right? You don't want the classroom to feel like this small radical bubble inside of a more regressive institution. One of the ways to start to do this is, like, once some of those relationships are built, is to seek to embed critical information literacy directly into the curriculum. I'm sure a lot of us have thought about how to embed information literacy itself into different things like the writing program or the first year experience program, but adding that critical component into it and getting students to really kind of question some of the foundations of information from the beginning can lead to these really fruitful conversations. And finally, in order to build community, especially with students, sometimes we have to get outside of the classroom, make ourselves available to them in the spaces that they are. I think about how many times I was like in a coffee shop, and I would run into people who are organizing shows in my area, and they would ask like, hey, are you gonna like help me fly or like get this stuff out? And I think that there's some application there of just like getting into a space where students are hanging out and encouraging them to be critical in their daily lives.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. So another strategy that we want to talk to you about is just sharing power in the classroom. So some of the things that can look like is clearly positioning yourself as a learner and a participant. I think one of my favorite parts about being a teaching and learning librarian is that I get to work with so many different subjects. But what that means is that I don't have like a mastery of the subjects that I am, or the classes that I'm going into. Even when I was an engineering librarian, I didn't really understand like the larger concepts, right? So, but I think that really offers us an advantage. You can say, hey, like, tell me about your topic. Like, I don't know, explain it to me. And so that you both start to be learners together. You're each teaching one another to solve the problem. And that can really go a long way to make students feel heard and feel comfortable. And you should encourage your students to shape the learning and direct the conversation. Like I said earlier, if you don't have to give up all power for in your classroom, but you should really listen to what the students actually want to know. You can have a broad objective, right? Like evaluating information or developing keywords, but students have their own experiences. And so you should value that and really listen to the ways they want to learn it, the ways that they've struggled in the past, and try and shape your outcomes around that. Don't go in with just a concrete plan and that's all it's going to be. And then it's really important to really early establish classroom norms with people, or with students, I should say. And this can come through, for me, it comes through a well-practiced and thoughtful preamble. And what I mean by that is just to tell students, like, this is your space too. I want you to be comfortable in it. If it means moving around, if it means getting up, if it means interrupting me so I can explain something more clearly, if that means keeping your camera off, if we're on a digital space, and if that means only participating through chat, like whatever that means to get yourself comfortable, please do so. I'm sure that I can improve that preamble to make it more clear, like more explicit, like what I would like this class to be. But the more you practice, the more comfortable it will be. And other teachers have different strategies, like playing music or conversing with students before the classroom. But I find that this works pretty well. And then it's important that you empower students' voices. Of course, like, these first two bullets, they really overlap well, but to encourage the authoritative voices of students and focus on the assets that these students bring into the classroom, it's really valuable to see yourself reflected in the class and to learn in ways that like reflect who you are and, are relatable to you. Students have both experience both in their lives and outside of the classroom that they bring to the instruction session. And it's important that we let them know that their experiences are valuable, that what they're saying is valuable, that we are not the only ones that have something to add. And to go along with that, it's important that you decenter your voice as the only one that can lend legitimacy to a student's idea. So I'm going to share a quote from Ron Scapp in a second, but what would I mean by that is to not necessarily, when a student shares with you, to not just go, oh, that's good, and then move on, right? Like, to add that value judgment. Instead saying like, oh, I hadn't thought about it that way, or I was thinking about it along the same lines. Does anyone else have, would anyone else like to share the way that they are thinking about it? And that still offers sort of some support for the student, but it doesn't just offer a value judgment and then moving on. It really allows other students to engage with that idea. And then, it can become a community conversation. And then it's important to position your students as participants in the scholarly conversation. I tell students all the time, as soon as they enter the classroom, you are a scholar, right? Like, you might not understand all the language that other scholars are using. You might not have the familiarity, but you are a scholar and you are a part of that conversation now. And it's important that you take yourself seriously as a scholar. I'm going to share another photo, sort of about sharing and decentering yourself. One of the things I love about hardcore is it removes a lot of ego oftentimes. So this is a photo of my friend Kane singing for a band called Spy, but he doesn't sing for that band. He was just given the mic and he was able to sing this song, and that's super common. And one of the first hardcore shows, the first hardcore show I ever went to, and probably the reason why I stuck it out for so long, was for this band called Terror. And the lead singer, Scott Vogel, said, this isn't my stage, this isn't the band stage, this is our stage. Everyone, has equal access to this, and if you want this microphone, come get it. We're not going to play an encore because we're not going to make you beg for anything more. Like, we're giving you everything we have and you deserve that. And I think that just really stuck with me. And it's an attitude that I've taken into the classroom. I don't want to have so much ego that I can't allow students to just take the class and run with it. Again, we have some teaching objectives we want to get to, but I want students to feel like they can really shape the learning experience that they are having. So this is a quote from Ron Scapp. In principle, the classroom ought to be a place where things are said seriously, not without pleasure, not without joy, but seriously, and for serious consideration. I notice many students have difficulty taking seriously what they themselves have to say because they are convinced that the only person who says anything of note is the teacher.
Thanks, Edward. Yeah, I really love that kind of concept of sharing power in the classroom, and that photo, I think, illustrates it so well, along with that quote. So what we've talked about so far with strategies, building community, sharing power, empowering student voices, these are all strategies kind of about framing the critical information literacy classroom But this strategy, I think, is more about the actual content that's delivered within the classroom. And so we summarized it as just sharing explicitly radical ideas. Chief among these is going to be challenging white supremacy in the classroom, kind of a rejection of neutrality, a rejection of perfectionism, a rejection of only one right way to do things. There's a lot of room, I know, for me to grow here in my understanding of how to best challenge white supremacy. But I think back to going to some punk shows where oftentimes the lead singer would like kind of open up almost with like a monologue about like issues in society at the time. And they were always these like radical rejections of hate, of white supremacy, of what was at the time like the political status quo, and a real challenge to anybody to think that that's normal or that's neutral, and to push past that and like and try to find and create new ways of thinking. And so being really explicit just in the classroom as well about this rejection of information as neutral. I think back to Edward's anecdote about talking to a student about AI and how there is racism kind of encoded into a lot of that. Also, this opens up conversations about critiquing capitalist power structures. So this is really easy to do when thinking about like information has value, pardon me. Talking about the value of information, talking about how much it would cost for students to access information were they not in libraries, talking about how much it costs for libraries to actually be able to provide access to this information, and starting to have some of those candid conversations can really lead to some interesting outputs. And yeah, and then questioning the construction of authority, I think was the first thing that I think was written about pedagogy and punk rock and bringing them together, just because that has always been a theme from punk, kind of going back into the 70s and probably before that with like proto-punk and that kind of thing. But it's something that has become really ingrained in a lot of us as we start to think about like as we think about authority as constructed and contextual, but kind of taking the critical component of information literacy and taking that a step further and saying like, okay, like let's deconstruct whose voices have authority in the scholarly realm. Let's talk about whose voices are often left out of that. Where might we go to find other sources and inject those voices that have been left out of the conversation into this conversation? So that kind of wraps up the strategies that we had identified, and we want to share the space with you all now to think about what strategies you might have from your own experiences that you can apply to your classrooms.
Yeah, so in our closing activity, and while we're doing this, we can gather questions for Q&A if you have any questions, but we'd like you to think about strategies for community building that you can implement from the community that you shared at the beginning of the presentation, or even another community. So I'll share just an example from my life. I recently started bouldering, rock climbing, and one of the things that I love is whenever a new problem comes up, when the walls change, everyone gathers around and there's just like a solving of the problem together as a community. And it's really wonderful because, you know, every climber is going to have a different style because of the way that they climb, because of their body type. And so everyone is just encouraging different people to try new things. And it's just nice to see that community problem solving. And I also just drag the next question over. So if you want to put your answers underneath that, or if you just want to comment on the answer that you already left. And we can take questions now as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Really feel free to engage with other folks' stuff on the Padlet as well. There have been a few really great additions since I was looking through them earlier. Really excited to see all the different areas that everybody's drawing on to inform their teaching practice.